By mid-1944, Belarus was a devastated rear area of German Army Group Center, not an empty space waiting for liberation. 3 years of occupation had turned much of the republic into a zone of supply routes, anti-partisan warfare, and mass killings. Modern estimates suggest that more than 2 million inhabitants were killed, about a quarter of the pre-war population. The prehistory of this destruction began before the German invasion. After the 1939 campaign in Poland, Western Belarus was incorporated into the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Soviet authorities replaced pre-war institutions and targeted groups defined as politically unreliable. Archival research indicates that in West Belarus, more than 100,000 people of various ethnic backgrounds were imprisoned, executed, or deported to the Soviet interior between 1939 and 1941. These measures left memories of repression that shaped expectations about any future Soviet return. The German invasion of June 1941 replaced this system with another occupation regime. Belarusian territory was divided between military command zones and the civil administration of Reichskommissariat Ostland, with General Bezirk Vice-Ruthenian centered on Minsk. German authorities deported around 380,000 people from Belarus for forced labor in the Reich. The Jewish communities of Belarus were almost entirely destroyed through ghettos, shootings, and killing sites such as Mali Trostenets. Under these conditions, a large Soviet partisan movement developed in forests and marshes. By 1943, more than 100,000 partisan fighters operated in and around Belarus, conducting attacks on rail lines, bridges, and local administrations. Their activity forced the Germans to divert frontline formations into the rear. Anti-partisan actions combined army, SS, and police units, and led to the destruction of many settlements together with their inhabitants, further blurring the boundary between front and rear. At the same time, not all inhabitants oriented themselves towards Soviet structures. A spectrum of Belarusian collaborationist formations emerged, ranging from village administrations and police units to military formations trained by German security services. Studies of auxiliary police indicate that in the general district of Belarus, around 30,000 men served in Schutzmannschaft battalions between 1941 and 1944. The coexistence of Soviet partisans, German occupation structures, collaborationist organizations, and a largely rural civilian population produced a complex and unstable social landscape. Villagers might supply food to partisan detachments at night and still have to meet German requisitions by day. Accusations of collaboration or of helping partisans could be driven by personal disputes as well as by ideology. By early 1944, the military front had reached the approaches to Belarus. After Soviet victories at Kursk and in Ukraine, Red Army formations pushed westward and compressed the German position. Army Group Center held an extended sector in Belarus with about 486,000 combat troops and limited armored reserves. Opposite them, several Soviet fronts assembled offensive groupings with more than 1,600,000 personnel and large concentrations of artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Within the Soviet system, the planned return to Belarus was understood as both military and political. Security organs such as the NKVD prepared to re-establish control over territories that had spent years under German rule. On the basis of pre-war practice and wartime experience, they used filtration and verification procedures for populations in retaken areas. Across the Soviet Union, more than 4 million repatriated civilians and former prisoners of war passed through filtration camps by 1946, most being released or remobilized, while a minority were sent to labor battalions or Gulag administration after accusations of disloyalty or collaboration. Thus, on the eve of Operation Bagration, different actors expected different outcomes from the same offensive. For Soviet commanders, it promised the destruction of Army Group Center and the recovery of Belarusian territory. For many Belarusian civilians, it offered an end to German occupation but raised questions about how Soviet authorities would judge conduct under foreign rule. For German leaders, it threatened the loss of a central sector of the Eastern Front, while for partisan detachments and collaborationist units, it signaled that local struggles over power, legitimacy, and future punishment or reward were entering a decisive phase. At dawn on the 23rd of June 1944, the front along Belarus remained quiet to many of the soldiers in trenches and dugouts, but Soviet artillery units were already calculating fire missions. In the sectors of the 1st Baltic, 3rd, and 2nd Belarusian fronts, thousands of guns and mortars were concentrated on relatively narrow break-in zones. For the German infantry divisions holding these lines, the density of Soviet artillery was significantly higher than in earlier battles in the region, reflecting several months of preparation and stockpiling. The opening bombardment, which began in the early morning, combined conventional shelling with targeted strikes against German command posts, artillery positions, and communications centers. Aircraft from the Red Air Force supported the barrage by attacking road junctions and rail hubs behind Army Group Center. This combination aimed to disrupt both the immediate frontline defense and the ability of German headquarters to coordinate reserves. For soldiers in forward bunkers, the first phase of Operation Bagration appeared as a prolonged series of explosions rather than a visible offensive. Soviet infantry units moved forward behind the creeping barrages, often supported by assault gun regiments and tank brigades prepared to exploit any gaps. In the northern sector near Vitebsk, rifle divisions of the 3rd Belarusian Front advanced through forested terrain, attempting to encircle German strongpoints rather than frontal assaults alone. Further south near Orsha and Mogilev, assault groups with sappers and flamethrower teams were tasked with breaching fortified positions that had been constructed over many months. On the German side, the opening phase was experienced as both expected and unexpected. Intelligence reports had indicated a possible Soviet offensive, and several divisions had prepared fallback positions and anti-tank defences. Yet the main effort of the Red Army fell on Army Group Center rather than on areas where German planners had anticipated the heaviest attacks. Communications breakdowns during the initial bombardment delayed requests for reinforcement. Some field commanders attempted local counterattacks by regimental battle groups, while others focused on maintaining cohesion during withdrawal to secondary lines. Command structures shaped how these first hours developed. On the Soviet side, the fronts participating in Bagration were subordinated to the Stavka, which could reallocate reserves among them as the situation evolved. Front commanders relied on forward command posts close to the line, connected by radio and landline to Army and Corps headquarters. Political officers and NKVD representatives accompanied higher staffs, documenting discipline and interactions with the local population in retaken areas. Their presence signaled that the offensive would also restore Soviet state authority behind the troops. In the German system, Army Group Center answered to the OKH in East Prussia, with individual armies responsible for long front sectors. When the first reports of Soviet breakthroughs arrived, staff officers had to distinguish between temporary penetrations and structural collapse. Some divisional staffs were already under strength, having lost experienced officers in earlier operations. In these circumstances, the ability to mount immediate countermeasures during the opening days was constrained by limited reserves and damaged transport routes. For civilians in front-line villages, the start of Bagration could be recognized in different ways. Some saw the bombardments and the movement of Soviet troops through fields and forests. Others encountered retreating German units requisitioning horses, carts, and food in order to move west. In certain areas, Soviet partisan units that had operated in the rear for years emerged openly, guiding Red Army scouts or occupying local centers before regular forces arrived. For inhabitants who had suffered under German occupation, these movements appeared as the first sign of a change in power. At the same time, the opening phase already introduced questions about what that change would bring. NKVD units followed behind advancing formations, setting up temporary filtration points at village schools, collective farm buildings, or former German offices. Men who had worn German auxiliary police uniforms, as well as returned prisoners of war and labor conscripts, understood that their past service would be examined. For them, the artillery barrage on June 23rd did not only mark a battle between two armies, but also the beginning of personal uncertainty about their legal and social position under the returning Soviet state. Within a few days of the initial assault, the results of these first movements became visible on the operational map. German forward positions in several sectors were penetrated or bypassed, while Soviet spearheads pushed toward key road and rail lines. Army Group Center remained intact as a command, but its ability to shape events at the front was already under pressure. The phase that had begun as concentrated artillery preparation and infantry assault was turning into a wider struggle for mobility, communications, and control of territory in which military and political actors operated side by side. The planning of Operation Bagration joined military, political, and security objectives into one framework. In May 1944, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, approved an offensive aimed at destroying German Army Group Center in Belarus, recovering the Belarusian SSR, and pushing Soviet forces to the pre-war western border in support of operations in Ukraine and the Allied landings in France. This meant not only defeating several German field armies, but also re-establishing Soviet state structures over a territory that had been outside its control since 1941. On the military level, Soviet planners concentrated an estimated 1,600,000 to 1,700,000 personnel, more than 30,000 guns and mortars, around 5,800 tanks and self-propelled guns, and almost 8,000 aircraft in four fronts: 1st Baltic, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Belarusian. The concept reflected deep operation theory developed before the war. Simultaneous blows on several sectors, designed to break not just the front line, but the entire operational depth of the enemy by encirclement. To preserve surprise, Stavka used maskirovka measures, including radio silence for regrouping, deceptive movements of formations, and preparation of false attack sectors along other parts of the Eastern Front. Logistics planning reflected the geography of Belarus. Large areas of forest, rivers, and marshes constrained movement, particularly for armoured units. Soviet engineers prepared pontoon bridges, ferry detachments, and specialised sapper units to cross the Dnieper, Berezina, and smaller rivers. Railway troops worked to restore lines behind the front so that ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements could follow the advance. Stockpiles of artillery shells and fuel were created close to the starting positions, accepting the risk that German reconnaissance might detect them in order to ensure that the initial assault would not be interrupted by shortages. In parallel, political and security organs developed plans for how to handle the territories that would be retaken. NKVD operational groups were attached to each front and army to move in immediately behind the combat units. Their tasks included screening returning Red Army soldiers, former prisoners of war, and civilians who had lived under occupation, as well as identifying people suspected of collaboration with German authorities. The existing filtration camp system, which by 1946 processed more than 4 million returning civilians and prisoners of war across the USSR, provided a model for these procedures in Belarus. Lists of potential collaborators were compiled in advance from pre-war security files, reports from Soviet partisans, and information gathered by underground networks. Research on post-war trials shows that categories targeted included former policemen, village elders under German rule, members of nationalist organizations, and individuals accused of participation in anti-partisan operations or denunciations. For Soviet authorities, these measures were framed as necessary to restore political reliability in a region where several years of occupation had produced competing structures of power. German planning followed a different logic. For the OKH and Hitler, Army Group Center's position in Belarus formed a salient projecting eastward, which they believed functioned as a shield for the Baltic region and Poland. Directives emphasized holding this Belarus balcony rather than trading space for time. Several key road and rail hubs, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, were designated as fortified places to be held, even if encircled, in order to tie down Soviet forces and delay any breakthrough. Intelligence assessments on the German side underestimated the scale of Soviet preparations in Belarus and expected a main blow further south against Army Group North Ukraine. As a result, mobile reserves were limited. Army Group Center had about 486,000 combat troops, just under 500 operational tanks and assault guns, and fewer than 1,000 aircraft available at the outset, many already committed along a very long front. Requests to withdraw to shorter defensive lines or to abandon exposed salients were rejected or delayed, reflecting both political decisions and a belief that Soviet forces might be overextended. Local German security and administrative organs also prepared for the possibility of Soviet advances. Plans existed for the evacuation of selected civilians, especially ethnic Germans and certain specialists, as well as for the destruction of infrastructure that could be used by the enemy. For auxiliary police and collaborationist formations in Belarus, German planning offered no clear, long-term solution. Some units expected to retreat westward with Wehrmacht formations. Others anticipated disbandment or transfer to anti-partisan duties in remaining occupied territories. Thus, on the eve of the offensive, both sides linked military planning with broader visions of the future of Belarus. Soviet staffs prepared to combine encirclement operations with the rapid restoration of party committees, state administration, and security screening. German command structures sought to preserve a central sector of the Eastern Front in the hope of stabilizing the war and keeping open routes from the Baltic to Central Europe. In between, Belarusian civilians, partisans, and collaborationist groups tried to anticipate which plans would prevail and what these outcomes would mean for their own status once the front moved through their towns and villages. In the last week of June 1944, the first engagements of Operation Bagration took distinct shapes along different sectors of the front, but all contributed to the same process of breaking Army Group Center's defensive system. In the north, near Vitebsk, Soviet Rifle Corps pressed through wooded terrain against German positions held by several divisions of the 3rd Panzer Army. Approximately 200,000 Soviet troops confronted about 70,000 German soldiers in this sector, with Soviet artillery and air forces working to isolate strongpoints from one another. Forward German regiments reported that lateral communications were cut within hours as Soviet units penetrated between defensive nodes. At Vitebsk itself, designated a fortress to be held even if encircled, German commanders tried to stabilize the front by committing remaining reserves. The urban area and surrounding river lines offered defensive advantages, but Soviet forces aimed to encircle rather than storm the city directly. Within 2 to 3 days, converging attacks north and south of Vitebsk narrowed the corridor to the west. German attempts to break out with ad hoc battle groups of a few thousand men each met concentrated artillery and anti-tank fire. Local command decisions involved balancing orders to hold the fortress with efforts to preserve at least part of the garrison. Further south, near Orsha, Soviet units faced positions anchored on the Minsk-Moscow highway, a key line of communication for Army Group Center. Here, elements of the 11th Guards Army and attached tank formations attempted to break through defenses manned by about 40,000 German troops with roughly comparable numbers of Soviet infantry but greater armor and artillery support. The first engagements focused on strongpoints covering road junctions and river crossings. Assault groups used sappers to clear minefields and demolish bunkers, while tank brigades waited for a sufficient breach to move through. German anti-tank guns and assault guns inflicted losses on the leading Soviet companies, but the pressure along a broad front gradually stretched the defense. Around Mogilev, the initial clashes combined river crossings, urban fighting, and attempts to maintain a coherent line while under attack from multiple directions. Soviet armies sought bridgeheads over the Dnieper and then pushed toward the city, which had also been declared a fortress. German forces, numbering perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 soldiers in the wider area, tried to hold outer defensive belts while preparing fallback positions closer to the urban centre. Early engagements took place in villages and on riverbanks where local civilians, who had already experienced occupation and partisan warfare, now saw a third phase of combat pass through their surroundings. The Bobruisk sector on the southern flank produced some of the most dynamic early movements. Here, the 1st Belarusian front concentrated armour and artillery to rupture defences of the German 9th Army. Soviet infantry and tank units, together more than 200,000 strong, attacked positions held by around 80,000 German troops. After initial clashes on the front line, mobile groups pushed into the rear, seeking to encircle German formations west of the Berezina. For frontline soldiers of both sides, these engagements involved rapid shifts between static defence, sudden bombardment, and ordered or improvised withdrawals. Partisan detachments, which had operated for years in forests and swamps, became more visible during this phase. In some areas, they attacked isolated German columns retreating along forest roads or helped Soviet reconnaissance units bypass strongpoints. In others, they focused on rail sabotage, cutting supply and evacuation routes. For German security units and auxiliary police, these actions intensified the pressure on already strained rear area defences. For villagers living near partisan bases, the increased activity brought both the expectation of imminent Soviet control and the risk of German reprisals during retreat. Civilian experiences in the first engagements were varied. Some communities were evacuated by German authorities, especially those linked to military installations, while others received only brief notification or none at all before the front arrived. In certain towns, local administrations organized columns of carts and pedestrians moving west alongside retreating units. In many rural areas, families remained in place, hiding in cellars or nearby woods during bombardments and waiting to see which uniforms would appear once the firing moved on. As Soviet forces advanced, initial contacts with civilians ranged from distribution of limited supplies to immediate questioning about German units, collaborators, and local conditions. Political workers and party representatives attached to frontline units began registering village councils and re-establishing Soviet symbols in public spaces. Security officers made preliminary notes on individuals who had held positions under German rule, expecting that more detailed filtration would follow once stable control was achieved. On the German side, the first engagements generated a pattern of urgent messages up the chain of command. Reports described breakthroughs, encirclement threats, and shortages of fuel and ammunition. Higher headquarters initially interpreted some of these communications as temporary crises that could be resolved by local counterattacks. However, as more sectors reported similar developments, it became clear that the offensive involved a coordinated assault along the entire Army Group Centre front. The early clashes of late June thus marked the transition from a defended line to a fluid battlefield, where decisions on when to hold, when to withdraw, and how to treat the civilian population had to be made under conditions of rapidly diminishing control. As the Soviet offensive continued into late June and early July, the local breakthroughs turned into an escalating crisis for Army Group Centre. Around Vitebsk, converging Soviet advances closed the last corridor to the west. Several German divisions, cut off in or near the city, attempted breakout operations with improvised battle groups. Columns of vehicles and marching soldiers tried to move along forest tracks and minor roads, often without clear information about Soviet positions. Many were intercepted by rifle units and tank detachments, leading to the capture or destruction of large parts of the encircled force. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of German troops in the Vitebsk area were killed or taken prisoner within a few days, removing a key component of the northern wing of the army group. In the Bobruisk sector, the pressure on the German Ninth Army increased. Soviet armour exploited gaps opened by infantry and artillery, pushing toward the Berezina crossings and rear area hubs. German formations found themselves attacked from the front and both flanks. Attempts to organise a controlled withdrawal were complicated by fuel shortages and damaged bridges. Some units managed to retreat in relatively cohesive order. Others dissolved into smaller groups that tried to reach the west bank of the Berezina and then moved toward Minsk. The destruction of bridgeheads created situations where columns of vehicles, carts, and foot soldiers crowded limited crossing points under air attack and artillery fire. The crisis extended beyond individual pockets. Communications within Army Group Centre suffered from destroyed lines, disrupted radio nets, and the loss of forward headquarters. Reports from 4th Army, holding sectors east of Minsk, indicated that its flanks were exposed as neighbouring formations fell back or were encircled. The leadership in East Prussia continued to issue orders to hold key fortified places, but staff officers on the ground increasingly faced contradictions between these directives and the realities of collapsing front sectors. Decisions to authorise withdrawals often came late, after Soviet spearheads had already reached roads designated for retreat. For Soviet commands, the escalation phase involved coordinating multiple encirclements while sustaining the offensive tempo. Logistics staffs had to move ammunition and fuel forward on damaged railways and roads overloaded with westbound columns. Medical units treated growing numbers of wounded, while field depots processed captured equipment. The Red Army also had to manage large groups of prisoners of war. Temporary enclosures were set up in fields and near villages, where German soldiers were disarmed, registered, and marched to the rear. Guard units faced the practical problem of escorting tens of thousands of prisoners through areas where supply and transport were already under strain. Civilians experienced the escalation in layered ways. Villages near encirclement zones saw waves of troops moving through in both directions, followed by columns of prisoners and vehicles left behind. Some inhabitants used the opportunity to retrieve property requisitioned earlier by German forces. Others tried to avoid contact with any military units, aware that both retreating and advancing troops might seize livestock, food, or shelter. In regions where German anti-partisan operations had left a record of destroyed settlements, news of the encirclement and capture of units involved in those actions circulated quickly among the population and partisans. Partisan detachments adjusted their activities to the new conditions. With the German front disintegrating, some groups joined Soviet regular units in mopping up isolated resistance. Others focused on taking control of local administrative centres before Red Army troops arrived in strength. This often placed them in a position to influence the first lists of individuals identified as collaborators. Long-standing local conflicts, family feuds, or disputes over land could now be framed in political terms, with accusations that an opponent had worked with German authorities or participated in police units. NKVD operational groups, moving close behind the front, expanded their role during this phase. Temporary filtration points were converted into more structured screening centres. Men and women who had served in German uniform, worked in occupation administrations, or spent years as forced labourers in the Reich were separated from other civilians. Initial interrogations recorded personal data, wartime activities, and contacts with German institutions. Many were released after short checks and ordered to return to work or join the Red Army. Others were detained for further investigation and transfer to interior camps. For Belarusian civilians who had adapted to occupation through a mixture of compliance, avoidance, and occasional covert support to partisans, the escalation of the offensive thus meant simultaneous processes: the rapid disappearance of German power, the the arrival of Soviet military and political structures, and the beginning of a new set of inquiries into their past conduct. For German soldiers, it marked the transition from holding a front to attempting survival in encircled pockets or during retreats under attack. For Soviet troops and commanders, it represented an expanding operational success that also generated mounting administrative and logistical tasks, as the front line moved west faster than many had anticipated. By early July 1944, the offensive reached its peak intensity as multiple Soviet spearheads converged toward Minsk. After the collapse around Vitebsk and Bobruisk, remnants of 3rd Panzer Army, 4th Army, and 9th Army tried to retreat westward along a shrinking network of roads. Columns of infantry, artillery, service troops, and refugees stretched for kilometers. Many moved without full divisional structure, reassembled into Kampfgruppen centered on surviving headquarters or regimental staffs. Air attacks, destroyed bridges, and fuel shortages slowed these movements, allowing Soviet tank and mechanized corps to overtake and cut them into new encirclements. The approach to Minsk combined frontal pressure with wide flanking maneuvers. From the north, formations of the 3rd Belarusian Front advanced through Logoisk and Borisov, crossing the Berezina at several points. From the south, units of the 1st Belarusian Front moved through Slutsk and Baranovichi, aiming to block routes leading from Minsk toward the west. In total, several 100,000 Soviet troops took part in this phase, while German strength in the Minsk area consisted of fragmented elements from more than a dozen divisions, along with rear services and security units. Within Minsk, German command posts received increasingly urgent reports of Soviet armor appearing on roads previously considered safe. Decisions had to be made between organizing a local defense of the city as a fortress or prioritizing breakout attempts. Some headquarters issued orders for immediate withdrawal, while others, following earlier directives, planned to hold positions until relieved. As Soviet units closed the ring west of the city, many German formations found their planned escape corridors already blocked. Combat around the city and in the surrounding forests produced high casualties on both sides. Soviet infantry and tanks attacked hastily prepared German positions along tree lines and village edges. German anti-tank teams attempted to delay the advance long enough for columns behind them to move. In several areas, last attempts at organized breakout were made by grouping remaining tanks and self-propelled guns into assault wedges, followed by infantry on foot. Where these efforts met concentrated artillery and air power, they disintegrated into small groups trying to reach the west through woods and marshes. For civilians in Minsk, the peak of the campaign brought a third transformation of the city within 4 years. After occupation and ghetto liquidation, the population had already been reduced and many districts destroyed. Now, artillery and airstrikes added new damage to industrial zones and transport hubs. Some inhabitants hid in basements. Others tried to leave the city with retreating columns or moved to nearby villages. When Soviet troops entered Minsk in the first days of July, they found a landscape of ruins, surviving residents, and traces of the occupation administration. At the moment of capture, different institutions moved in alongside combat units. Party committees were reconstituted, local Soviets appointed, and provisional executive bodies formed. NKVD representatives secured archives, police buildings, and former German offices, searching for documents about occupation policies, collaborators, and underground networks. Temporary detention points were established to hold former German officials, policemen, and individuals denounced by neighbors or partisans. At the same time, efforts were made to restore basic services, water supply, limited electricity, and emergency medical aid. Outside Minsk, the encircled forces in the surrounding pocket continued fighting for several days. Groups of German soldiers, sometimes numbering in the thousands, were surrounded in forested areas and along river lines. Soviet units called on them to surrender, using loudspeakers and leaflets, while preparing artillery concentrations in case of refusal. Many groups capitulated after exhausting their ammunition and supplies. Others tried night marches through swamps, leaving behind heavy equipment. For prisoners of war, the end of the pocket meant the beginning of long marches to rear camps, guarded by units that also had to cope with their own supply demands. At higher command levels, the destruction around Minsk forced structural changes. Army Group Center, which had entered June with hundreds of thousands of troops, lost much of its strength in killed, wounded, and captured. Replacement formations, reserve divisions, and hastily assembled battle groups were directed toward the new line forming further west, but these forces could not immediately compensate for the loss of experienced units. For the Red Army, the peak of Bagration produced one of its largest operational victories, yet it also generated extended supply lines, growing numbers of wounded to treat, and administrative responsibilities over vast territories and populations that had been outside Soviet control since 1941. The destruction of Army Group Center did not end organized resistance. As Soviet formations advanced toward the Niemen and Bug rivers in July and August 1944, German command attempted to establish new defensive lines with remaining units and reinforcements brought from other sectors. Panzer divisions and ad hoc armored groups were committed to counterattacks near Grodno, Bialystok, and along major road junctions. Their aim was to slow the Soviet advance, cover the withdrawal of rear services, and prevent crossings into East Prussia and central Poland. For frontline Soviet units, this meant a shift from large encirclement operations to a sequence of local battles against mobile reserves using short, concentrated blows. Within the Red Army, adaptation focused on maintaining operational tempo despite extended supply lines. Railway troops repaired tracks toward Minsk and further west, replacing damaged bridges and restoring key junctions. Motor transport columns were reorganized to cover longer distances, and captured German vehicles were pressed into service where possible. Commanders rebalanced their forces, rotating exhausted rifle divisions to the rear and bringing forward fresher units for continued advances. Artillery and air support had to be redistributed across a broadening front, with priority assigned to sectors where German armoured counterattacks were expected. Partisan forces also entered a new phase. Many detachments were formally incorporated into the Red Army or internal troops, with personnel assigned to rifle units, reconnaissance companies, or NKVD battalions. Others were disarmed and demobilized, especially where their structure did not fit regular army organization. This process reduced the autonomy that partisan commanders had exercised during occupation. At the same time, their detailed knowledge of local terrain continued to be used for guiding troops, locating minefields, and identifying former German positions and supply caches. Resistance took different forms among Belarusian civilians and among those associated with German structures. A portion of collaborationist police and auxiliary units withdrew west with retreating forces, later appearing in newly organized formations in Poland, the Baltics, or Germany. Others dispersed into the countryside, discarded uniforms, and tried to present themselves as ordinary villagers when Soviet authorities arrived. Some individuals who had held intermediate roles under occupation, such as village elders or technical specialists, attempted to demonstrate their usefulness to the restored Soviet administration in order to mitigate possible sanctions. NKVD and state security organs adapted their methods as they moved from frontline screening to systematic control. Filtration points expanded into a network of camps and transit centers where former prisoners of war, Ostarbeiter, and people returning from German territories were processed. Questionnaires, cross-checking of testimonies, and comparison with partisan reports were used to classify individuals as cleared, suspect, or subject to arrest. Those cleared might be sent back to their home regions or mobilized into labor battalions or the Red Army. Those deemed suspect could be detained for further investigation or transferred to corrective labor camps. In villages and towns, Everyday adaptation often involved careful management of information. Families with members who had been in German service, whether as forced labourers, policemen or clerks, had to decide what to disclose during registration. Some emphasised connections to partisans or relatives in the Red Army. Others relied on local reputations and support from neighbours. Long-standing social relations played a role. Testimonies from villagers could confirm that an individual had tried to protect inhabitants during occupation, or, conversely, could support accusations of abuse and collaboration. Psychologically, the rapid change of regimes required different actors to reassess their position. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had advanced hundreds of kilometers in a few weeks, encountered communities that greeted them with a mixture of relief, caution, and questions about missing relatives. German soldiers who escaped encirclement had to integrate into new units along the shortened front, often with reduced expectations of the overall strategic situation. Former partisans shifted from irregular warfare to life under restored state structures, with some gaining positions in local administration and others encountering scrutiny over their wartime decisions. The adaptation also had a spatial dimension. Entire regions of Belarus had lost large portions of their pre-war population. Fields, workshops, and rail yards needed labour at a time when many able-bodied men were still at the front, in captivity, or under investigation. Soviet authorities responded with measures such as labour mobilizations, re-establishment of collective farms, and relocation of workers from other republics. These steps altered the demographic composition of towns and countryside, laying the groundwork for post-war reconstruction, but also setting conditions under which questions about wartime loyalty and responsibility would be addressed in the years after the front moved further west. By August 1944, the military phase of Operation Bagration was drawing to a close. Soviet forces had reached the Vistula and entered eastern Poland, while Army Group Center had lost most of its divisions in Belarus and along the approaches to Warsaw. Historians estimate that 28 of 34 divisions of the German 3rd Panzer, 4th and 9th Armies were destroyed, and that Soviet troops advanced several hundred kilometers, ending German control of pre-1941 Soviet territory. For the Red Army, this was a decisive turning point in the Eastern Campaign. For Belarus, it marked the beginning of a different phase, in which frontline combat gave way to the reordering of population and political structures. As the front moved west, NKVD and military counterintelligence organs shifted from supporting the offensive to consolidating control over liberated territory. The network of filtration camps, originally created for prisoners of war and civilians from occupied zones, became central to this process. Across the Soviet Union, about 4.2 million repatriated civilians and 1.5 million prisoners of war passed through filtration by early 1946. Archival data indicate that most were eventually sent home or remobilized, but significant minorities were assigned to labour battalions or transferred to the NKVD for further punishment. Approximate proportions for all repatriates were about 58 to 80% released, 14 to 19% drafted into military or labour formations, and 6 to 7% handed over to security organs. Belarus occupied a particular place within this system. One post-war summary notes that by March 1, 1946, 4,199,488 Soviet citizens had been repatriated, including 520,672 sent to Belarus, with another 102,893 arriving there between 1946 and 1952. These returnees included former forced labourers, prisoners of war, evacuees, and civilians who had lived under occupation. Each group underwent filtration at border camps or in regional centres. For many, the process ended with registration and release. Others were assigned to reconstruction projects, collective farms, or military units. A smaller portion, considered politically unreliable or accused of collaboration, were transferred to special settlements or corrective labor camps far from Belarus. At the same time, Soviet courts and military tribunals began large-scale proceedings against alleged collaborators. Research based on Central Soviet records suggests that around 320,000 people across the USSR were tried in closed courts for collaboration between 1943 and 1953. Belarus, as a region with extensive German occupation and a dense network of auxiliary police, featured prominently in these statistics. Although precise, Republican figures remain debated. A modern survey of Belarusian KGB archives notes at least 152,399 criminal files, covering no fewer than 235,552 citizens, many relating to political accusations, wartime collaboration, or anti-Soviet activity. A majority of these individuals have been rehabilitated in the post-Soviet era. On the ground, this turning point was felt in households rather than in staff maps. Men who had served in German police units, local administrations, or anti-partisan formations faced arrest when Soviet power returned. Some surrendered voluntarily, hoping their case would be mitigated by family testimonies or prior service in the Red Army. Others attempted to conceal their past, integrating into collective farms or factories under new identities. For relatives, the sequence often began with a summons to NKVD officers, followed by transfer to a distant camp or special settlement. In many cases, information about the final place of detention or sentence arrived late or not at all, creating the impression that family members had simply disappeared. Not all targeted groups were defined as collaborators. Belarus also experienced population movements connected to new post-war borders. Western districts annexed in 1939 and confirmed to the Belarusian SSR after 1944 contained large Polish communities. Under Soviet-Polish agreements, hundreds of thousands of Poles were resettled westward from former eastern Poland, while some Belarusians and Ukrainians moved in the opposite direction. These transfers were framed as organized repatriation, but for many families, they involved compulsory departure, loss of property, and the severing of local ties formed over generations. For Soviet authorities, the combination of filtration, trials, and population transfers was presented as a necessary step towards stabilizing a devastated republic, eliminating perceived threats, and rebuilding industry and agriculture. For former partisans integrated into security organs, it could appear as a continuation of struggle by other means, now directed against those labelled as enemies inside the rear. For a segment of the Belarusian population, especially families of men arrested as collaborators or nationalists, the same policies defined the moment when liberation from German rule turned into long-term separation, exile, or silence about absent relatives. Thus, the turning point after Bagration was not a single decree or operation, but the gradual shift from wartime frontline fighting to peacetime mechanisms of selection, classification, and removal. The military map no longer showed large pockets and encirclements in Belarus, yet new forms of uncertainty emerged as individuals passed through filtration, courts, and transports whose destinations lay far from the villages and towns that had just been declared free. In the months after the front moved west, combat operations inside Belarus tapered off into mop-up actions against isolated German groups and scattered armed bands, but the country remained a war zone in material and demographic terms. German formations that escaped encirclement during Bagration withdrew toward East Prussia and central Poland, leaving behind destroyed rail junctions, mined roads, and abandoned equipment. Soviet units continued clearing operations into late 1944. Yet for many villages, the formal end of fighting coincided with the discovery of minefields in fields, unexploded ordnance in buildings, and mass graves near former execution sites. Post-war surveys recorded the scale of physical destruction. On the territory of modern Belarus, more than 9,200 villages and over 1 million houses were destroyed or burned during the war. Major cities such as Minsk and Vitebsk lost more than 80% of their pre-war building stock. Industrial plants, bridges and power stations required reconstruction virtually from the foundations. Combined with war losses and displacement, this meant that by 1945, Belarus had lost a very high share of its pre-war population, 30%, with estimates ranging from roughly 1/5 to close to 1/3. For families who had survived occupation, the first post-war winter brought shortages of housing, fuel and food, rather than a rapid normalization of life. Soviet authorities responded by reimposing pre-war structures and launching reconstruction campaigns. Party committees, executive committees, and collective farm administrations were re-established in districts across Belarus. Priority was given to restoring rail traffic, repairing key factories, and sowing fields for the 1945 harvest. Labour was mobilised through a combination of volunteer campaigns and obligatory assignments. Returnees from evacuation or forced labour were directed to sectors with urgent needs, sometimes far from their original homes. For local residents, these measures looked like a continuation of wartime mobilisation under new conditions, with extensive obligations but limited immediate material benefit. At the household level, the end of combat brought a different set of uncertainties. Many families had members missing in various directions, killed at the front, deported for labour to Germany, evacuated to the interior, or arrested as suspected collaborators. Repatriation statistics show that more than 4.2 million Soviet civilians and prisoners of war returned from abroad by early 1946, with Belarus receiving over 500,000 such returnees. For each arrival, there might be others who did not come back. In numerous villages, people remembered the year of liberation as the moment when German rule ended, but also as the point after which relatives vanished into filtration camps, prisons, or distant settlements without clear information. Legal and administrative procedures structured this disappearance from the public view. Individuals arrested as collaborators, members of nationalist groups, or political opponents were often tried in closed sessions of military tribunals or special boards. Across the Soviet Union, around 320,000 people were prosecuted for wartime collaboration between 1943 and 1953. A survey of Belarusian security archives has identified at least 152,399 criminal case files concerning more than 235,000 persons for political and wartime accusations, many opened in the immediate post-war years. A majority of these individuals have been rehabilitated since 1991. Not all were deported, but significant numbers received sentences involving long-term imprisonment or special settlement in remote regions. At the same time, population transfers reshaped the western borderlands. Under Soviet-Polish agreements, inhabitants identified as Polish from western districts of the Belarusian SSR moved toward the new Polish state, while some Belarusians left territories annexed by Poland. These organized exchanges, combined with the earlier evacuation and later voluntary migration, contributed to a perception that communities were losing members through multiple channels: wartime deaths, border changes, and state-directed movements. In local memory, these processes often merged, reinforcing the impression that a large segment of the population disappeared in the years immediately following liberation. For Soviet officials and many former partisans, the aftermath of Bagration signified the successful removal of German occupation and the necessary neutralization of people considered dangerous to the restored order. For families whose relatives were arrested, sentenced, or resettled, the same period marked the beginning of long uncertainty, with sparse information and official silence about their fate. For historians reconstructing these events through archival records, the picture that emerges is one of overlapping mechanisms, judicial, administrative, and territorial, that turned military victory into a complex demographic and social transformation, in which liberation from one regime coincided with the enforced absence of tens of thousands of Belarusian citizens under another. In post-war Soviet accounts, Operation Bagration appeared primarily as a textbook example of successful offensive warfare and national liberation. Official histories emphasize the destruction of 3 German armies, the advance to the Vistula, and the role of Belarus as a partisan republic that supported the Red Army. Victory parades, monuments, and school textbooks presented the summer of 1944 as the moment when Belarus was finally freed from occupation and reintegrated into the Soviet state. The emphasis fell on military achievement, partisan heroism, and the restoration of pre-war borders, with little attention to the internal consequences of filtration, trials, and deportations. At the strategic level, Bagration had enduring effects on the wider war. The collapse of Army Group Center created a gap in the German front that was never fully repaired. It opened routes for Soviet advances into Poland, the Baltic region, and toward East Prussia, while overextending German forces already engaged in Italy and France. The loss of experienced infantry divisions, artillery, and command staffs reduced the capacity of the Wehrmacht to mount large-scale counter-offensives on the Eastern Front. For Allied planners, the operation demonstrated that the Red Army could conduct deep operations on a scale that reshaped the overall balance of the European war. For Belarus, the long-term consequences were measured less in maps than in demographic and social data. The combination of wartime killings, starvation, forced labor deportations, frontline fighting, and post-war arrests left many districts with altered age and gender structures. Large cohorts of men were absent because they had been killed in combat, executed under occupation, or sentenced to terms in labor camps and special settlements. Reconstruction policies accelerated urbanization and industrialization, drawing people from the countryside into cities that were rebuilt with new layouts and industries. These processes created opportunities, but also reinforced the distance between public narratives of liberation and private memories of loss. The fate of those who disappeared after 1944 became part of this discrepancy. Families whose relatives were arrested for collaboration, nationalist activity, or other political accusations often received limited information. Sentences were issued by closed tribunals. Notifications arrived late or described destinations in general terms such as corrective labor camp. Official discourse discouraged open discussion of these cases, especially where they touched on partisan operations, village-level conflicts, or the role of Soviet security organs. As a result, many households lived with incomplete knowledge of whether a relative had died in German captivity, Soviet custody, or continued to live in a distant settlement. Historians studying archival records after 1991 have attempted to quantify these processes more precisely. They distinguish between several overlapping categories: people deported from Belarus during German occupation for forced labor, those who never returned from Soviet evacuation, individuals arrested and sentenced in the immediate post-war years, and populations resettled because of new borders with Poland or assigned to special settlements as socially alien or politically unreliable. Estimates for those removed from Belarusian territory in the mid-1940s for political or security reasons vary by methodology, but they consistently indicate tens of thousands of individuals, and some interpretations suggest numbers approaching or exceeding the symbolic figure of 100,000 over a broader period. Memory of Bagration and its aftermath diverged along these lines. Veterans of the Red Army and partisans often recalled the operation as the decisive moment when their home republic was freed from German rule and mass killing. For them, the presence of Soviet power, however strict, meant the end of open occupation policies that had targeted entire categories of civilians for annihilation. Families marked this memory through participation in Victory Day commemorations, care for war memorials, and preservation of letters and photographs from the front. Other groups formed different commemorative frameworks. Relatives of those arrested or deported after 1944, as well as communities affected by population transfers, developed more ambivalent narratives. In their accounts, the summer of liberation was followed by visits from security officers, departures of arrested men, and years of uncertainty. For Jewish communities, the liberation of Belarusian territory highlighted the absence of pre-war neighbors and the difficulty of commemorating sites of mass murder within a broader narrative that focused mainly on partisan struggle and Red Army victories. In the late Soviet period, some of these tensions appeared in local histories and private correspondence, but rarely entered public debate. Only with the gradual opening of archives and the emergence of independent scholarship did historians begin systematically to compare NKVD reports, court records, and demographic data with long-standing family stories. This research has not eliminated controversy. Interpretations differ over the relative weight of military necessity, political control, and personal score settling in post-liberation arrests and deportations. Debates also concern how to integrate the experience of collaborationist units, whose members range from ideological opponents of Soviet power to individuals compelled by survival or local circumstances. Today, the legacy of Operation Bagration in Belarus and beyond is therefore multi-layered. On one level, it is studied as a major military campaign that contributed decisively to the defeat of Nazi Germany. On another, it is a case study in how liberation from an occupation regime can coincide with renewed mechanisms of state repression and forced population movement. Public commemorations, academic works, and family memories do not always align, but together they document a complex sequence in which victory removed one system of domination while reinforcing another, and in which the advance of front lines was followed by quieter processes that reshape the composition and memory of society long after the guns fell silent.